Let's talk about what an operation manager will do inside of a company. We're going to go over the 10 strategic decisions that an ops manager will make. And their basic management functions really revolve around planning, organizing, staffing, leading, and controlling what's going on within an organization. So the first decision is really talking about the design of goods and services. They'll define what is required of operations, and they will also work with the product design, determining the cost, quality, sustainability, and the human resources needed for a project. One thing I do want to bring up is when we see the word sustainability, a lot of times we think just about environmental sustainability, but when you look at it from an engineering point of view, sustainability is talking about more than just that. It's, can we continue to service? Can we continue to get the raw materials? Can we continue to produce the item? And sometimes you'd think that, yeah, well, we can always make something, but that's not entirely true. One example off the top of my head, if you think about it, rocket engines, especially the exhaust cones for them, the United States used to lead the world in that in the 60s during the space race and everything. We've gotten to the point where we could not make those engines anymore from the Saturn V rocket because we've lost the ability. We did not design them in a very sustainable way to keep us to being able to produce them, and it takes time to reacquire that art. And so it's important, especially if it's going to be the backbone of your company, that you're making a product or a service that is sustainable. If you had a company that had cornered the market on making buggy whips, well, that wouldn't be a sustainable business because we don't use horses and carriages as much anymore, and so your entire product would be wiped out. Telephone repair people, and I'm talking about the old rotary push button phones, not the cell phones that everybody's got now. Film, camera film. If you think about it with Kodak's having to reinvent themselves because film isn't being sold the way it was when I was a little kid. And so these are the kind of things that operations managers will have to look at. Managing quality. And so this is where you have QA departments and whatnot in the company. And so one of the things they have to do is determine the customer's quality expectations, low cost versus high quality. And this is, depending on the product, this is a key thing to come up with. So when you're buying a car, does your company want to make the cheap car to try to sell a lot of them? But how do you make it cheap? Substandard parts, outsource to China and things like that. Or are you going to make the more expensive, high quality version that you're not going to sell as many, but you're going to be able to charge a higher price for? And so you need to establish those policies and procedures to identify and achieve that quality that you're looking for. They're also responsible for process and capacity design. How are we going to make the good or service? If it's a manufactured item, are we going to make it here? Are we going to make it in Canada? Are we going to make it in China? If it's a service, where are we going to do things at? And so they're committed to the management of the specific technology, the quality, the human resources, and investments to maintain that process. Something else, and then this would be, if you really want to think about a location strategy, if you're like running in a fast food location or someplace that has a lot of little locations, this would be, how do they determine where you're going to put the next McDonald's or Starbucks? That's the kind of thing that operation would look at the data and figure that out. And so you have the location strategy. So how close do you need to be to customer, suppliers, and talent? And actually, especially after the COVID epidemic of 2020, this might be something that's changing a lot since companies are opening more to a remote workplace. Do we really need to have all of our entire workforce on 2 floors of a building in New York City, or can we cut costs there and move things out? And so that, falls into this. You're considering the cost, the infrastructure, the logistics, government, and typically we're talking about government regulations. Can we make something here where the regulations are a lot more strict, or do we send it to some place where the regulations really are much more lax? And actually, that's where you'll end up seeing a lot of difference in cost because of the cost of compliance. In the United States, for a long time, you've seen a lot of the automotive stuff and some of the other manufacturing stuff get offloaded to a different country where their environmental laws, where their labor laws are much more lax than the United States. And so this is all part of those decisions. And so then you also, operations manager figures out, should we, manufacturing on demand, do we put it in warehouses? Do we have retail service locations? So this is all the kind of decisions that they will end up making. Layout strategy. So basically if we've got a factory, how do we lay that factory out to make it as efficient as possible? This is a lot of times talking about processes and whatnot. This is where you're going to hear a little bit about the entire thing with like lean manufacture and 5S and things like that come up, is how do we set this up to make it efficient? And that's a word I'll probably end up using quite a bit when we start talking about more and more operations management, is really focusing on being very efficient. Operations managers also look at human resources and job design, so how to recruit, motivate, and retain personnel with required talent and skills. And this gets very important, especially when you're manufacturing, and especially in some fields where the manufacturing is more of an art than a science. And so you really have to worry about keeping those key people to keep things going, and not only keep things going, but also to pass that knowledge along to the next generation of workers. And all of this is really integral and an expensive part of the system design, because when you've got someone that has key skills, you're probably going to be paying them more. And so there's going to always be this constant balancing act of, you'll see people that, well, we want to get rid of these people because they make too much money, we can hire somebody cheaper. And then it's, yeah, we can hire somebody cheaper, but they don't have the experience and talent level of these other people. And this is actually something you can relate back to sports, because they're constantly going, especially if you're looking at like hockey or football or something, with a salary cap. Do we keep the aging star who's just great, or do we try to replace him with a rookie that's going to be a lot less expensive? Is it really worth it? And that's kind of the same kind of decision that's going on. So supply chain management, and like I said, during 2020 with the COVID stuff, you might have actually been hearing about this in the news. Your supply chain is this global network of organizations and activities that's supplying you with what you need to run your company. And so you really need to integrate that supply chain into your strategy and be able to take care of problems when they come up. And this is also, determining who am I going to purchase from, under what conditions am I going to do, and as I mentioned earlier, things like the modern Anti-Slavery Act of Britain. Now you have to worry about what their company is doing. So this is all stuff that you have to spend time and cost into investigating and making sure what's going on. So we have inventory management. Now this is going to be a big thing for companies, because you have to sit there and go, what are we ordering? What are we holding on to? How do we optimize it to make it the best as possible? So how much to order, when to order, because it costs money to hold on to stuff in a warehouse, but you also want to make sure that you can get those parts out to people as quickly as possible, because they're not happy if they can't get their things in a timely manner. Case in point, I have a recall on my Jeep, and I've had to wait 3 months to get the part. I wasn't very happy about it, but they weren't stocking and producing them quick enough. And but that's the kind of things that we will think about when we're dealing with inventory management. So scheduling determines what the schedules are going to be and how to utilize personnel and facilities while meeting customer demands. If we're manufacturing, once again, let's use the example of Jeeps. If we're manufacturing Jeeps and all of a sudden we've got more Jeeps ordered than we know what to do with, do we go to another factory? Do we retool another factory to make parts for the Jeep? Or do we keep going what we're doing? And so this is what the operation manager has to do, is has to look at, does it financially make sense to turn over more of our production capabilities to producing the Jeeps? because they have, once again, a balancing act, because you can't just create production capacity out of nowhere without building a new factory, which is a very long-term decision. If we increase the capacity of making Jeeps, well, then we have to reduce the capacity of making like a Grand Cherokee. And so they need to really look at and figure out where the demand is, where the cost is, and how things are going in the future. And this is one of the big things that they're looking at. And so the last thing really is maintenance. And so they're looking at, they have to consider what our factory capacity is, what the demands are, what the personnel are. And we have to really figure out, how do we keep this reliable and process, and I'm sorry, how do we keep this process reliable and stable? So during the wintertime, once again going back to the Jeeps, maybe we're not producing as many Jeeps. So does that mean that we get rid of staff? Well, if we get rid of staff, that means that in the summertime when we sell more, we'd have to hire them on. So what's the optimum number of staff? Well, maybe we keep it staffed at a certain level that maybe not keeps up with demand in the summertime, but produces extra stuff in the wintertime to cover that shortfall that we have during the summer. And it's all a numbers game, and that's what an operation manager does. So these are like the big strategic decisions that an operations manager would have to make within the structure of a company.